In the spring of 1935, buried beneath a stack of misfiled floodplain assessments in the Charleston Municipal Archives, a small envelope was discovered. It bore no return address, no postage, and no name. Just a single word written in trembling graphite across the flap: hollow. Inside were 7 photographs, poorly exposed and unnumbered. Each depicted the same view from a different angle: cabins without chimneys, windows without glass, doors nailed shut from the inside. But it was the 8th image, found pressed flat between the cardboard backing, that troubled the archivist most. It showed the forest floor beneath one of the homes, split open at the seams, with something pale and rope-like reaching up from the soil, fingers perhaps or roots mimicking their shape. The house in the photo could not be identified. The region marked on the envelope, Whitlock's Hollow, did not appear on any map issued by the Geological Survey, nor did it appear on state plats, property rolls, or federal census charts. Between 1900 and 1930, the land remained entirely undocumented. No births, no deaths, no burials, no graves. And yet, something lived there. Good evening, and welcome to Gothic Ledger. Before we open this record further, I invite you, wherever you are, whatever time your hour keeps, to tell us where you're watching from. What county or country, what time of night or day, let us know in the comments. And if you find yourself drawn into the darker folds of history, do consider subscribing to the channel and lighting the bell. It helps us keep these stories from being buried again. The object we begin with today is not a relic in the traditional sense. It is not a weapon or a diary or even a tooth. It is a silence, a prolonged, preserved stillness where noise should have existed, a void in the records where people were seen but never counted, children photographed but never named, homes built, boarded, and never burned. Later attempts to reclaim the land failed, not due to topography or weather, but because the soil itself refused to hold structure. Posts shifted, foundations cracked, entire buildings sank in silence without struggle. And when men returned to investigate, they did not find bones. They found space. What follows is not the story of a massacre, nor an epidemic, nor even a haunting in the traditional sense. This is the slow unearthing of something designed not to be found, a place intentionally erased not by time but by intent, not because it was empty but because something inside it remained unfinished, and beneath it all something waited, quiet, remembering, still breathing. Welcome to Whitlock's Hollow. In the winter of 1935, during a routine flood risk survey of the Congaree River Basin, a federal assessment team received a parcel from the estate of a deceased Civil War collector in Charleston. Inside was an officer's coat, Confederate gray, moth-eaten, the cuffs still stiff with preserved blood. Nothing in the shipment was expected to be of consequence until a technician noted the inner lining had been crudely restitched. Beneath 2 layers of faded cotton, hand-sewn into the breast, lay a parchment folded so tightly it crumbled at the edges when removed. It was a map, not one drawn with any degree of precision, but with unusual intention: rivers marked in ash, trees illustrated by fingerprint, and a single human figure scrawled in the corner, standing alone in the marsh. There were no roads, no compass points, and no names except for 3 words etched near the bottom in coal: Whitlock's Hollow. The problem, as noted in later memos, was that no such place existed. State records showed no town, no farm, no tribal remnants within a 10-mile radius of the marked coordinates. County plat maps from as early as 1824 showed that particular stretch of land as empty, reliably so. Yet the location drawn on the parchment coincided almost exactly with a stretch of floodplain that surveyors had long regarded as impassable due to its depthless mud and irregular magnetic activity. The decision to investigate was not made immediately. It was only after a junior cartographer, whose name is omitted from all final reports, became violently ill while handling the map that it was recommended the team proceed into the woods. He was said to have whispered, shortly before collapsing, that he could hear breathing through the paper. The phrasing was dismissed as fever. When the team arrived at the site, there were no structures visible, only layers of pine and cypress tangled so tightly that then light bent strangely between the branches. Compass needles quivered. The air held the dull, sweet stench of fermenting algae and animal rot. Yet 20 feet into the overgrowth, the men found evidence of prior habitation, a row of rusted nails in the shape of a doorframe, further in, a collapsed fence. Then something unmistakable, a child's toy carved from gator bone, sitting atop a stone step half sunk in loam. Anomalies mounted. The terrain seemed to reset behind them. Marked trees were found unmarked again when circled back. One member of the team reported hearing their own voice echoing seconds before they spoke. Another became disoriented and walked in a spiral for over an hour, teeth chattering, though the day was warm. When the team attempted to leave, the youngest member, aged 22, refused to move. He had drawn a copy of the original map in charcoal the night before. When compared side by side, his version had changed. The handwritten name, once Whitlock's Hollow, now read simply, "We are beneath." He did not speak again. Though no official discovery was recorded that week, the land was quietly reclassified in agency files as geologically unstable and culturally sensitive. The map was not returned to storage. It was locked in a lead-lined drawer and refiled under a different name. For decades afterward, field teams assigned to that region of South Carolina were rotated out after no more than 3 days. And yet, in a forgotten drawer at the State Historical Archives in Columbia, the coat still hangs, its lining resewn as if untouched. By the spring of 1935, 3 weeks after the initial map discovery, a secondary team was dispatched to validate whether Whitlock's Hollow had ever been accessible by known passage. Their survey began with elevation charts and soil erosion patterns, but what emerged was a deeper and more curious absence. There were no historical traces of roadwork, footpaths, or animal cart trails leading in or out of the area. Tree ring studies confirmed that the forest surrounding the site had remained undisturbed since at least 1870. There had been no clearing, no chopping, no directional growth to suggest light from a path. It was as if the woods had grown with the specific purpose of closing something in. Nearby counties had little to offer in explanation. Local records were vague. When questioned, elders in 2 of the closest settlements, Fairhope and Pinebridge, claimed that something old once lay beyond the marsh, but that their grandparents had been told not to ask. The phrase "tree-bound twins" recurred in multiple interviews, always delivered as a joke, though the laughter failed to carry. One man recalled hearing that the children of that place had faces too alike to count and moved in unison if startled. Another remembered a woman who emerged barefoot from the thicket one summer in 1909, dragging a sack of hair. Her eyes, he said, looked borrowed. Despite proximity, no known merchant routes intersected the land, nor did postal or telegraph services ever attempt to chart a course through it. The region had been skipped entirely during the Rural Expansion Acts of 1912. Surveyors later noted that magnetic compasses spun erratically within a 2-mile radius, often pausing to point not north, but toward the same small glade near the hollow's center. Those tasked with aerial reconstruction had little more success. The earliest photographs, taken by biplane overflights in 1926, owed a dense canopy broken only by irregular clearings, none larger than a standard parlor. One such clearing, in the shape of a perfect square, was flanked by 4 tall pines of identical height. Though the square appeared too even to be natural, no structure could be confirmed beneath the foliage. Later frames captured faint glimmers beneath the trees, metallic reflections in symmetrical positions. When enhanced, These glints revealed themselves to be glass, possibly window panes, though no building shape could be discerned. Whatever stood beneath the canopy had been designed not to rise, but to remain hidden. Travellers had rarely ventured close. One family, migrating north in 1883, reported seeing children in the woods, barefoot, pale, unmoving, watching from between pine trunks in complete silence. When the father approached, none ran. They only tilted their heads in synchrony and began to blink at odd intervals, never once making sound. The family moved on, cutting their journey short by 3 days. What remains troubling is that no roads ever appear to have existed, yet supply artifacts were later recovered: tools, cloth, flour sacks marked with shipment dates. Trade had occurred, but not by path or trail. The deliveries must have come by foot, through brush too dense to pass without deliberate effort. One theory, rarely discussed in print, proposed that the settlement may have trained its youngest to navigate blindfolded through the woods, using only smell and sound. A missing child from 1913 was found 3 counties away, with resin burns on her palms and wax residue in her ears. She could not speak, but carried a single object in her hand, a length of bone carved into the shape of a key. Her origin was never traced, and her eyes, according to the nurse who recorded her intake, did not match. Between 1900 and 1930, 3 federal censuses passed without a single recorded entry from the region, now believed to have encompassed Whitlock's Hollow. On every ledger, the surrounding counties were meticulously logged: parcel divisions, household heads, even livestock counts, but the hollow remained a blank corridor, a perfect void carved into bureaucratic routine. Attempts to explain the absence were limited and inconclusive. State officials later claimed the region's terrain made enumeration impractical, though internal routing maps from the era suggest otherwise. One inspector, assigned to an adjacent county in 1910, described the eastern ridge as quiet pasture and noted a narrow band of smoke drifting daily from the lowlands. He marked it with a circle, but did not cross the tree line. What disturbed researchers decades later was not only the absence of names, but the absence of claims. Land that fertile, close to water, dense with timber, should have invited competition. But no deeds were filed, no tax receipts collected, not one estate transfer or inheritance case emerged from the region across 3 generations. It was as though no one ever died, or no one ever left. The only contemporary reference to inhabitants comes from a letter dated July 1899, written by a travelling textile merchant whose route spanned the inland Carolinas. In it, he noted a delay caused by a wood path that shouldn't have been, which led to a clearing of roughly 40 cabins. His account, though brief, remains one of the few direct civilian mentions. He described the cabins as assembled in an inward-facing ring, with no signs of recent trade or light. There were children, many of them, unshod and watching. He remarked that they were same of size, same of eye, same of chin and colour, and ended the paragraph with an observation that has since become a fixation for folklorists. 2 children with the same face. The merchant fell ill shortly after. His handwriting deteriorated in later correspondence, and by 1902 he had been committed to a private sanatorium in Savannah for what was then termed cognitive frailty with optical recurrence. He died 3 years later. His records were destroyed in a fire. Census teams were never instructed to enter the hollow. Whether this was policy or happenstance remains unclear. But a 1920 routing error led 2 enumerators onto a parallel path roughly half a mile east of the known perimeter. One reported glimpsing a structure cut into the earth rather than built upon it, though he was later told it was likely a root cellar. The other man quit the bureau within the month, citing a need for a quieter place to pray. No birth certificates, marriage records, or death notations were ever filed from the region. When matched against school rosters, church rolls and physician ledgers, the result was identical: nothing. And yet from 1905 to 1918, midwives working in 3 surrounding towns reported a recurring dream of being watched from beneath a wooden floor by children who never blinked, none of the women ever met. All described the same face. When state geologists returned to the region in 1974 to reassess flood viability, they carried with them modern instruments, subsurface scanners, aerial thermographs, and archival overlays. None of them found what they expected. In a settlement with documented habitation for at least 3 decades, there should have been graves, a cemetery, stones or wooden markers, or some shallow indentations in the earth. But Whitlock's Hollow offered none. The scans were definitive: no depressions, no mineral disturbance from decomposition, no signs of ritual burial. Even the common markers of animal interment, nests of bone, insect tunnels, soil loosening, were absent. It was not that graves had been lost, it was that they had never been attempted. This revelation troubled not only the surveyors, but the archivists who had reviewed local testimonies from the early 1900s. In nearby towns, it was long believed that the Hollow's people feared the soil. Superstitions varied. Some claimed the land expelled the dead. Others whispered that buried things returned, not as ghosts, but as something needing to be fed. While such beliefs were dismissed in academic circles, a regional clergyman once recorded a sermon fragment from 1906, delivered by a boy no older than 12. The child had been found wandering the forest in a linen shift, hair caked with river silt. He was said to have spoken of souls pinned beneath beams and warned the congregation never to leave the body in reach of the earth. The account was burned by the presiding bishop, though a copy survived in a private ledger. Local vegetation told its own story. Plant growth near the Hollow's center was abnormal, uneven, yet not wild. Trees grew in mirrored pairs. Certain patches remained perpetually bare, as if something below denied them nourishment. Moss was sparse. Birds avoided the canopy. No carrion insects were observed. Decaying trails curved unnaturally wide of the interior. All known signs of natural death were missing. The absence became more disturbing when compared to recovered domestic items. Throughout several of the Hollow's cabins, officials found remnants of cloth bindings, strips of muslin knotted with wax thread. One still held fragments of hair, as though cut rather than shed. They were arranged in circles beneath the floorboards, alongside dried animal hides. None showed teeth marks or clawing, but some bore grooves, as if something had been gnawing from within. During a later review, it was noted that several floorboards had been replaced, crudely, with mismatched lengths of timber, and the nails driven in at odd angles. Beneath one of these, a narrow cavity had been filled with ash. No fire residue, no charcoal, just fine, sifted ash, and what appeared to be part of a jawbone, too small to be bovine. There are no burial records, yet death was not absent. A population must decline or reproduce, and this one did both. But the rituals of disposal, funeral, stone, ground, were entirely bypassed. One theory, whispered only in private, suggested a different kind of mourning, not a burial, but a keeping. And if that were true, the question was never where the bodies had gone, but who was still sleeping above them. In March of 1935, following a legislative push to update the state's hydrological maps, a federal floodplain assessment team was assigned to the region once marked by the name Whitlock's Hollow. The order was procedural, a mere redrawing of elevation lines ahead of planned dam expansions, but the internal memos suggest an unspoken urgency. While the stated purpose was flood prevention, a supplementary directive instructed the team to take note of aberrations in human settlement or land use, though no explanation was provided for the phrasing. The 5-man unit departed from Colombia under clear skies. They were equipped with standard tools, altimeters, soil augers, topographic guides. The youngest among them carried a camera, though none of the photographs were ever developed. What is known comes from the handwritten notes of the lead hydrologist, recovered from his briefcase 3 days after the expedition abruptly ended. Their first sighting of the hollow was not visual but olfactory. The air thickened several hundred yards from the tree line, heavy, still, and metallic. The men described a smell like wet rust, layered over with something biological, though not immediately identifiable. The scent clung to their equipment and clothing, growing stronger as they moved inland. What struck them first was the silence, not the quiet of wilderness, but an engineered stillness. No insects, no birdsong, not even the creak of tree branches. The forest had soundproofed itself. One of the men reportedly tapped a pine trunk and waited for the echo. None came. The town itself, if it could be called that, emerged in fragments. First a wooden sign, its paint long eroded, buried in leaves, then cabins, identical in proportion, each spaced precisely apart, each facing inward toward a square clearing that held no structure. The windows were shuttered from within, doors bolted, chimneys sealed over with clay and moss. No smoke, no voices. According to the notes, the team knocked on 12 doors, no response. At one cabin, they thought they saw movement through a slat, pale and small, like a child's face withdrawing into shadow. But no one emerged. Inside the homes they managed to enter, the scent of mildew deepened into something sour and sweet, like meat turned gelatinous. One home was coated in dust, yet the bed had an indentation as though recently slept in. A woolen blanket remained folded at the foot, flecked with white hairs. Beneath the bed, a wooden bowl had been placed upside down, its inside scorched black. The hydrologist noted a sensation that something was off, not in any singular moment, but in the totality. The cabins were inhabited, yet no signs of movement or noise could be traced. It was as though the residents had been instructed to remain still until the intruders passed. On the second night, one of the men claimed to hear footsteps on the roof. Another awoke to find his boots turned backward beside his cot. A third scratched at his arms until they bled, mumbling that something was trying to climb out. By the morning of the 4th day, the team requested emergency withdrawal. In the final lines of the hydrologist's notes, one phrase had been circled twice in pencil: "No signs of burial, no signs of decay, but something is not gone." The cabin doors had been closed again behind them. Not one creaked, not one protested, as if they were used to opening and closing without human hands. The team's second full day in the hollow was spent surveying the cabins, which had at first appeared modest and time-worn, but on closer inspection their uniformity became difficult to ignore. 42 structures stood in a loose spiral formation, spaced with near-perfect precision. Each was built from the same timber, unvarnished pine, pale and faintly swollen from humidity. The siding bore no nails, only wooden pegs. There were no signs of expansion or repair, no additions, no personal flourishes, as though each had been constructed from a single shared memory. The ceilings inside were unusually low, pressing down just above head height, and often sloped unevenly, though none leaked. There were no chimneys, nor any hearths. Most lacked a kitchen or place to cook, and not a single window was openable. Each one was sealed from within, not boarded for protection, but fitted into its frame with tar and resin. The glass in several was distorted, giving the appearance of water pressed against the pane from the inside. Despite the climate, no stoves were present. One home contained a small pile of lard candles wrapped in cloth, each unburned. Another had a bed made entirely of braided roots, arranged so densely they resembled rope. A third contained a chair with a hollowed-out seat, beneath which was a compartment filled with flattened twigs, all split to a point. The team's lead hydrologist later noted that the homes seemed suspended in time. Nothing was visibly deteriorating, yet nothing had been cared for either. There were no scuffs, no chips, no children's scrawlings on the walls. The homes appeared used, but never lived in. Each cabin had one locked door at the rear, always the same proportions, and always reinforced from the inside with overlapping boards. The hinges had been filed smooth, making them flush with the wood, deliberately engineered so that the door could not be pried open. One of the men attempted to lift a floorboard near the threshold, only to find it had been nailed down from below. Of the few doors forced open, most led to rooms that were empty, but for traces of human presence. Straw scattered across the floor, a doll made from sheep's wool and dried berries, a boot with the laces sewn shut. But none of the rooms had windows, and all of them were lined with vertical scratches, always on the interior side of the door, low to the ground, as if made by fingers or dull nails over years of repetition. Some were singular, others layered, like grooves carved into wood by something trying to remember its shape. When the team returned to the same cabins on the third day, several doors they'd left open had been closed again. Their footprints had been smoothed over, as if wiped by cloth or brushed clean with leaves. The smell in those homes had changed. Damp earth now mingled with something sweeter, like spoiled fruit or sun-warmed milk. At one cabin, the bedsheets had been turned down. None of the men admitted to doing it. No one claimed to have seen movement, but in the margin of a field notebook, beside a penciled floor plan, one of them wrote a question not spoken aloud. "Are we sure they aren't still here?" Among the few standing structures spared collapse, the one-room schoolhouse stood in unusual condition. Its roof sagged, but had not broken. The door creaked, but held its hinges. The interior had been stripped of furniture, save for a single desk pressed against the far wall, its top drawer swollen shut with moisture. It was there that the records were found, 5 brittle ledgers bound in twine, stained with mildew, but largely legible. Their contents were not voluminous. A single entry per child, no more than a line each, no dates of birth, no parental details, no academic marks, just names. Every child listed between 1907 and 1933 carried the surname Whitlock. Not one deviation, no other family names appeared, and no indication was made of who had recorded the entries. The handwriting shifted subtly between volumes, suggesting different hands across time, but the ink remained consistent, oak gall, thick, almost oily. Some letters had bled through the page, forming mirrored shapes on the reverse side, as though anticipating repetition. It was the given names that troubled the archivists most. Each generation appeared to recycle the same limited set: Elias, Ruth, Caleb, Thalia, Matthew. Their order varied, but the pattern held, a circular naming structure, repeated with exacting regularity every 6 to 7 years. No surnames were paired, no middle names were offered. One child listed in 1921 had a given name struck through and rewritten as the name of a child from 1914. The correction was made in the same ink, and the original name was never used again. Speculation emerged that the names were not chosen, but inherited in a ritualistic sequence, possibly assigned at birth based on a strict internal code. More chillingly, one theory suggested that names were not given to new children at all, but transferred. This theory gained traction when photographs were examined. Decaying. Ed between the pages of the third ledger was a sheaf of thin, faded photographs, Each showed a group of school children standing outside the same building in different years. In every image, the children were nearly indistinguishable. Same pale expressions, same postures, same parted hair. Their clothing changed, but the bodies did not seem to age. The same face recurred in images taken 10 years apart, smiling in one, vacant in the next. An anthropologist reviewing the images noted minor discrepancies, subtle shifts in eye spacing, brow shape, jawline, but concluded that the children were not genetically diverse. Rather, they were branches of the same lineage, repeating on a loop, both biologically and administratively. It was not reproduction in the traditional sense, it was refinement. The schoolhouse contained no chalk, no books, no evidence of lessons taught, only the names. Later, in the ruins of one cabin, a wall was found marked with carved tally lines, 42 in total, each ending with a cross. A note was scribbled on the back of one ledger, faint and smeared by water. Its final line read, "When a child dies, we wait. When the name returns, the child walks again." The implication was not that names honored the dead, but that names summoned the living. While adult presence in Whitlock's Hollow remained elusive, the children were seen, not within the cabins, but always in the woods, silent, watching, unmoving, until approached. The first observation came from a member of the hydrology team who'd gone to relieve himself behind the schoolhouse and returned pale and shaking. He described seeing 3 figures in the tree line, barefoot and still. All were the same height, dressed in what appeared to be hand-stitched garments without seams or fasteners. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their heads tilted slightly to one side, as though trying to hear a sound that hadn't yet occurred. The team dismissed the reporter's stress until further sightings occurred. By the end of the second day, 4 separate men recorded glimpses of what they referred to only as the small ones, always in peripheral vision, always near the edge of visibility. None were heard speaking, none were seen eating. Their posture, too, was curious, neither relaxed nor alert, but held in a state of readiness, as if waiting to respond to a cue from somewhere beyond human hearing. On the 3rd day, one child was approached. He, or it, was found crouched beside a stump, hands folded in its lap, unblinking. The boy did not run when seen. Instead, he remained in place until one of the men stepped within 10 feet. Then he bared his teeth, not in fear, but in what one described as a warning without voice. The gums were dry, the teeth mismatched. Several appeared filed. When another man tried to circle around him, the boy vanished, not by running, but by dropping flat into the underbrush with such precision that the ground seemed to absorb him. Later inspection of the site revealed no footprints, only a small patch of dry pine needles turned in a spiral as though something had rotated in place. Worse still were the reports of duplication. On the 4th evening, 2 surveys. Oars independently described seeing a child seated on a fallen log beside the marsh. Both sketched what they had seen in their field books without conferring. When the sketches were later compared, they matched precisely. Same angle of spine, same tilt of head, same scar running from jaw to collarbone. One man insisted he'd seen the child that morning 2 miles east, near the cabins. The other swore it was a girl, not a boy, and that she had opened her mouth to speak, but no sound had emerged. A medical officer reviewing their reports speculated that the children may have suffered from congenital defects, possibly the result of severe endogamy, but this did not account for their sameness, or for the way they always appeared in odd numbers, never even, always 1, 3, or 5, never 2. A final notation scribbled in the margin of a surveyor's map reads only, "They don't blink when we do. They're waiting for something, but I think they already know who we are." The map was later found folded inside his boot. The ink had bled into the leather, but one word remained legible: returning. The discovery of the trapdoors was not immediate. Only after the fourth cabin had been cleared did one of the surveyors step through a soft plank in the back room, his leg disappearing into darkness. When they pried the flooring open, they found it. An access hatch, flush with the boards and painted to match the surrounding wood, bolted in a perfect square. The mechanism had not rusted shut, but rather had been deliberately sealed from beneath, the edges reinforced with a paste of lime and clay, smeared thick like mortar and packed with pine straw. Upon opening it, the smell rose first, not decay, but dampness long held, a stagnant breath from below. The ladder had rotted, but the shaft remained intact. It descended no more than 7 feet, leading to a chamber carved directly into the soil, its walls reinforced with timber slats and clay render. It was not large, it was not meant to be. In the center of the room lay 4 iron rings bolted into the earth, each marked with deep rust. Beneath them the soil had hardened and cracked. Bits of rope remained, frayed and brittle. One segment still bore the faint impression of a knot. A dark stain, nearly black, spread outward from the rings in the shape of a star or burst, though whether it was human blood or animal fluid could not be confirmed. There were no bones, no hair, no burial, and yet the space held a stillness that did not feel empty. Each cabin revealed the same. Identical trapdoors, identical construction. The chambers beneath varied slightly in dimension, but not in purpose. Some contained thin wooden slats leaned upright against the walls, as if used to separate or divide. Others had small shelves, recessed into the dirt, upon which sat objects too mundane to explain. A child's shoe wrapped in twine, a jar of teeth, a bird's wing pressed between panes of glass. None of the items bore labels. None gave clues. One amber had been reinforced with stone and lined with animal hides, tacked flat against the walls. They bore no markings, no pigment. But when a light was held close, faint outlines emerged, fingerprints, hundreds of them, pressed from the inside out. A medical officer, present during excavation, noted that the dimensions of the rings suggested restraint, not confinement in the sense of caging, but anchoring, keeping something in place, not because it was dangerous, but because it had to remain still. He observed that the ring placement, 4 points, equidistant, often surrounding a blank patch of dirt, resembled the layout of an examination room, but no cabin contained surgical tools, and no evidence of healing. What disturbed them most was not what they found, but what had once been there and left no trace. No exit tunnels, no claw marks, just silence and packed earth. One final note appeared in a field journal days later, penned without attribution. It read simply, "We sealed them in to keep them quiet. Not safe, just quiet." And beneath that, in handwriting not matching any of the team, was a second line, smaller, nearly illegible. But they do not forget the shape of the room. By the 3rd night in Whitlock's Hollow, the sounds began. At first, the men assumed it was wildlife, possums or field mice slipping through the underbrush, the normal life of a forest settling into dusk. But these sounds came not from outside, but beneath, and they did not move away when approached. A junior geographer sleeping in one of the larger cabins was the first to report it. He described a soft, rhythmic brushing beneath the floorboards, intermittent but purposeful, not skittering, not random. A pattern, he said, like fabric dragging across packed soil. When he rose to investigate, it stopped. But when he lay back down, it resumed, closer this time, directly beneath his cot. He did not sleep again that night. By morning, 2 other men had reported similar disturbances. One heard knocking, always in groups of 3. Another claimed to hear slow, shallow breaths exhaling through the cracks in the floor, followed by a long pause, as if something were listening. Not all accounts were taken seriously. One man refused to re-enter his cabin and instead slept upright on the porch with his boots still on. Another began gagging each time he stepped inside, as though the air itself had shifted. The situation escalated when a sealed basement chamber was forcibly opened. Unlike the others, this one had never been breached, its mortar still intact, its boards untouched. It took 3 men to pry it loose, and when they did, the stench rose so quickly that 2 of them vomited where they stood. The air that escaped was warm and heavy, wet with rot and iron. One man dropped his lantern. Another, known for his composure under field pressure, requested reassignment that same evening. No explanation was entered in the log. Inside the chamber was little. No bodies, no artifacts, only claw marks raked across the floor in wide arcs, as though made by something large with dull, persistent hands. At the center of the space they found a single stone, placed intentionally. Smooth, flat, and warm to the touch, despite the surrounding soil. Beneath it, nothing, only dark earth, soft and undisturbed. Later that night, the surveyor who had initiated the breach was found sitting outside the same cabin, staring at the floor. His boots had been removed. His socks were wet. When questioned, he only said that something had knocked on the inside of the floorboards, not from beneath, but between the boards themselves, as though trapped in the walls of the wood. He was discharged the following morning, under the notation of psychological strain due to field fatigue. That same day, a portion of the clearing was found sunken, a shallow dip in the earth no more than 3 feet wide, the soil around it cracked in a perfect ring. When tested, the ground beneath was hollow, untouched by roots or rock. Nothing was excavated, no one volunteered. A final note appeared in the team's departure report, written in the margins beside a map of the settlement. We came to measure the land, but the land has already measured us. There was no further contact with the site for over 2 decades, but in the years that followed, field teams elsewhere in the state began reporting similar sounds: soft brushing, distant breathing, floorboards settling in perfect rhythm, always at night, always in 3s. The fragments were not discovered in the field. They were found in a crate stored beneath the archives of the Charleston field office, mislabeled as masonry samples. There was no record of how or when they arrived, no shipping manifest, no sender, just a wooden box lined with cotton gauze, and inside 4 partial skulls, each belonging to what appeared to be a child no older than 10. The medical examiner who first handled them described an immediate discomfort, not from decomposition, there was none, but from proportion. The skulls were misshapen, though not fractured. The craniums had expanded laterally, causing the eye sockets to slope outward and upward, as though built to see from below. One mandible was absent entirely. The others showed underdeveloped dentition, yet the sutures of the skull had already begun to fuse, suggesting a biological age far beyond what the bone size indicated. The report, marked confidential, referred to interrupted maturation and genomic looping, a term not standard in medical lexicon. It was later speculated, quietly among only the most senior analysts, that the phrase implied something intentional, not merely the result of inbreeding, but a process of controlled heredity, performed repeatedly over generations, each iteration narrowing the genetic pool further toward a specific form. One skull bore a small borehole at the crown, not surgical, crude, as if drilled manually, then cauterized. A trace of blackened resin was found within, consistent with the pine pitch used elsewhere in the hollow's construction. The examiner noted this might have served not as treatment, but as preservation, preventing something from escaping rather than entering. In a separate internal memorandum filed under the heading Genetic Retention Patterns, Whitlock settlement, a theory was proposed, though never endorsed officially. It stated that the hollow may not have viewed inbreeding as degeneration, but as refinement, that the settlement had sought not purity of bloodline, but consistency of outcome. To that end, relationships would have been selected not based on love or even availability, but on resemblance. Each generation repeating the same selection, the same pairings, until the resulting children were near copies, biologically close enough to be mistaken for siblings born years apart, yet mentally staggered, frozen in physical youth but neurologically aged, a form of stasis not through medicine but repetition. This would explain the photographs, the children who did not appear to age because they did not change, the same child over and over again, with slightly adjusted eyes, slightly narrower jaws. Time was not linear in Whitlock's Hollow, it was recursive. One field surgeon reviewing the case scribbled a question into the margin of his copy. If they removed too much variation, could they still be called human? His question was never addressed. In the final drawer of the schoolhouse, a worn wooden toy was found, an animal carved without eyes. Beneath it, a scrap of cloth with a stitched name. It matched the skull fragment's inventory tag, and it matched a living child's name listed in the 1927 ledger, 7 years after the skull had been buried. The chapel was not marked on any of the initial maps recovered from Whitlock's Hollow. It stood at the far edge of the settlement, obscured by a copse of sapling pines and a growth of thornbrush that seemed at first accidental. The building itself was unremarkable. 1 room, no bell, and no cross. Its windows were covered with what appeared to be parchment stretched taut across wooden frames, blotted with moisture stains and symbols painted in a language not confirmed as English, nor traced to any known local dialect. The altar had rotted. The pews were gone. But beneath the warped floorboards, in a compartment concealed by a false joist, a scroll was found. Handwritten, stitched into itself with thread, spun from darkened hair and bound in animal hide. It had no author, no date, and no opening verse. Its title, written across the middle of the first page in heavy ink, read, "The Return of Flesh." The text did not resemble scripture. There were no parables, no divine lineage, no invocations of a higher order. Instead, it resembled instruction, a ritual document, exacting in tone, almost clinical in its directives. It forbid burial, warned against flame, and condemned the severing of familial bonds through death rites. The phrase, "to leave the body to soil," appeared multiple times, always followed by a warning that the soul, if discarded, would sour and take root again beneath the house where it was born. One passage described the old mistake, referring to an unnamed ancestor who was buried outside the hollow and whose cries were later heard rising through the wood of his children's beds. Another warned that if any limb was taken beyond the boundary of the pines, it would rot outward until the whole line failed. This was followed by a diagram, crude, almost childlike, of a body bound and kept upright in a wooden box, with holes for breath and feeding. The caption beneath read simply, "He waits until his name is given again." The doctrine emphasized preservation, not of spirit, but of pattern. Flesh, it claimed, was not finite but repeatable, and must be kept in proximity to its source. Kin were to remain near. No sibling was to be buried apart. No parent lowered into foreign ground. Instead, the flesh was to be dried, preserved, or sealed, kept warm, kept close, kept still. A final stanza, placed at the very end of the scroll in a smaller hand, described something called the seventh waiting. It was vague, poetic in structure, and spoke of a moment when the children remember too early, and the doors beneath them forget to stay shut. What this signified is unclear, though a field officer noted its placement directly above a faint set of inked fingerprints, pressed into the parchment, not drawn. They were child-sized and identical, printed in a ring around the final words. One of the analysts reviewing the scroll noted the grammar of the phrase "return of flesh" was unusual. Not the return to flesh, but flesh itself returning. Not resurrection, but repetition. The scroll remains sealed in climate-controlled storage, but according to its last reader, the hide it was written on had begun to stretch, as if it still recognized its own name. One of the earliest anomalies recorded by the federal team was the total absence of flame. Not merely unlit hearths or extinguished lanterns, but the utter lack of any structure built to sustain fire. None of the cabins bore chimneys. There were no stoves, no blackened pots, no ash pits or scorched earth near the dwellings. Even the chapel, long abandoned and weathered by the elements, contained no trace of candle soot along its beams. What little light the homes received came from narrow slits cut high in the walls, angled so sharply that only a sliver of sun could enter at midday. This was not oversight, it was enforcement. Later excavations of the basements revealed a substitute for heat. Wooden frames strung with sinew, tightly wound, suspended like primitive scaffolding just above the packed dirt floors. Some held linen sheets that had stiffened into curled drapes. Others carried more troubling residue, stains deep and brown, mottled in places, and often clumped at the edges, as if something had dried and cracked there repeatedly. A few of the racks bore embedded objects pressed into the strands, small, white, and irregularly spaced. The forensic team later identified them as human deciduous teeth. These were not cooking structures, nor were they for curing meat in the conventional sense. There was no evidence of salting, no brining basins, no scent of preservation compounds. One chamber held dozens of fingernail parings arranged in a spiral, tucked between folds of hide. Another featured a basket filled with scorched doll heads, each one partially melted, despite no visible fire source. Their eyes had been gouged, but their faces were identical. An anthropologist assigned to the investigation suggested the possibility of solar preservation, heatless drying facilitated by controlled airflow and humidity. Yet the air in Whitlock's Hollow had never been dry, and no airflow was permitted through the cabins. The windows were sealed, the doors reinforced, the basements closed by weight and mortar, designed to trap air, not circulate it. A single reference to fire was found carved into the underside of a drawer in the schoolhouse. 4 words, barely legible, etched with what appeared to be a needlepoint. "Do not wake them." It was believed to relate not to sleep, but to combustion. That fire, in whatever belief system governed this place, had the power not to destroy, but to disturb. The absence of flame had been a doctrine, not out of fear of destruction, but of release. One team member, searching the outer perimeter of the village, found a cairn built entirely of charred stones. Beneath it, buried in a hollow log, was a set of vertebrae fused by intense heat. The ash surrounding them was old, too old, dated to nearly 60 years before the team's arrival. No other fire had ever been lit since, no others recorded. And though none dared speak it plainly, a question emerged among the team. If the town forbade burning, what was it they were so afraid might rise from the smoke? That night, 2 cabins shifted. No wind, no quake. Just wood groaning inward, as if bracing against something beneath the floor that had not yet decided to surface. The recommendation to evacuate Whitlock's Hollow was submitted on the evening of March 28, 1935. It was not written in haste. The federal team had, by then, completed their fieldwork, logged their findings, and made clear that the settlement posed no hydraulic threat, but what they had seen could not be squared with protocol. The documents framed their reasoning in terms of public health and infrastructural decay. But between the lines, there was fear. The order, signed at the district office in Columbia, gave the residents of Whitlock's Hollow 10 days to vacate. Notices were printed, hand-delivered by a field agent, and nailed to the doors of all 42 structures. None were acknowledged. No objections were filed. No one emerged. 3 days after the notices were posted, the same agent was dispatched to verify their receipt. He found the signs still nailed in place, untouched. Inside the homes, chairs had been turned to face the walls, beds stripped, dried vines arranged in loops across the floors, as if laid deliberately in some unnoticed rite. And beneath the trapdoors, each of which had remained sealed during the initial assessment, new evidence surfaced. They were no longer shut. According to the agent's account, every one of the trapdoors had been pried from below. There were no signs of splintering, no damage to the nails. The seals of lime and resin had been removed cleanly, as if softened and peeled away by hand. The chambers beneath remained intact, empty of bodies, but each now bore a distinct marking at its center, a smudge of wet earth, freshly disturbed despite the absence of rain. The evacuation was never enforced. When the federal team returned 3 weeks later, the settlement was silent, not in the manner previously observed, but hollowed, void. The cabins were vacant, yes, but not abandoned. Fires had never been lit, yet embers were found in hearths that it did not exist weeks earlier. A jug of water sat on a windowsill, still beaded with condensation. A scrap of cloth remained caught in a doorframe, as though pulled from a shoulder not an hour before. There were no tracks, no carts, no trail of belongings, but the most troubling discovery came from the marsh at the far end of the hollow, where the tree line broke into slow-moving water. The dogs brought by the team's new lead refused to enter the clearing. One whimpered, then bolted. Another lay flat and would not rise. The men proceeded alone. At the water's edge they found footprints, small, barefoot, and recent, pressed into the mud in concentric rings. The prints led nowhere. They circled a shallow pool and ended at its banks. The water was still. The trees reflected in perfect symmetry, but the reflections did not match the sky. A final observation, handwritten in the margin of a field sketch, noted that several cabins appeared misaligned, not broken, shifted, as though pulled inward by inches, like furniture being adjusted around an unseen center. No residents were ever located, no further orders were issued. But on the 4th morning, a child's voice was said to have echoed across the water, not calling for help, not speaking at all, just breathing. By 1942, the land formerly known as Whitlock's Hollow had been declared structurally viable for development. The war effort required timber, rail lines, and housing for relocated labor. Engineers brought in by the state began clearing the edge of the marsh, laying the first foundations for what was to be a rural depot. Soil reports indicated no instability. The surface was dry, the water table consistent. And yet, within 3 weeks, the concrete poured for the main structure had split down the center, cleanly, as if sliced from below. What followed over the next 8 decades was a pattern that repeated itself with irregular precision. Any attempt to build, bury, or root into the ground met with quiet, insistent failure. Posts leaned, pipes burst, trees planted along the perimeter refused to anchor, tipping over in full bloom as though their roots had encountered something and recoiled. A housing contractor in 1956 halted work without explanation after losing 2 workers to what he described as earth collapse, though no sinkholes were found. The men had disappeared during a lunch break. Only their tools remained, upright, untouched, still warm from use. In the 1960s, a family attempted to homestead the land. They lasted 6 weeks. The father wrote in his final letter to a cousin in Asheville that they couldn't sleep for the breathing, and that the sound came not from the wind or the trees, but from the soil itself. long exhalations, as if something vast and low were resting just beneath. His letter was never mailed. It was found folded into a jar, buried at the edge of their property, capped with salt and pitch. Later, environmental studies found that the hollow's topsoil remained unusually loose, not soft, but unfixed. Shovel marks left at dusk had vanished by morning, and freshly dug holes never held shape. When filled with water, they drained too quickly, and when left empty, they filled again without rain. In one case, a temporary survey flag was found 12 inches deeper than where it had been driven the day before, still upright, undisturbed. According to an unofficial oral record compiled by a preservationist in the 1980s, locals referred to the hollow as sleeping ground, not haunted, not cursed, simply unwilling. Those who dared step into the deeper groves reported the sensation of walking across something breathing inward, the earth soft not with decay, but with patience. In 2001, a team installing fiber optic cable beneath the nearby highway reported tools failing without warning, signal devices going dark underground, and a faint ticking sound audible only when the workers stood still. One technician described it as rhythmic but misaligned, like a clock built from bone, measuring something that could not be seen. The land remains untouched. Deer will not graze. Birds pass overhead without circling, and at night those who live along the eastern edge of the swamp say they hear footsteps in pairs, always moving in parallel, always beneath. Some believe the hollow is a grave that remembers too much. Others claim it was never a grave at all, only a waiting room, and that nothing beneath it ever truly died. Today, no homes remain in Whitlock's Hollow. The last known structure collapsed in 1978 without wind or rainfall. The ground beneath it had simply given way. Efforts to rezone the area ceased soon after, citing unpredictable subsurface instability. No soil studies have been conducted since. But for those who walk the tree line near the old marsh, the silence still lingers, unnatural and absolute, a silence that seems to listen. Some say the land sleeps, others believe it remembers. But no one who has entered in recent decades has chosen to stay. Not because of what is seen, but because of what never leaves the edge of hearing. The faint breath behind the trees, the movement beneath the boards, the names spoken from mouths long buried, but never burned. If you've stayed with us this long, thank you for listening. These stories are fragile, found in attic boxes, faded from ledgers, scratched into the margins of forgotten files. They persist only when spoken aloud. If you'd like to keep them breathing, we invite you to subscribe to Gothic Ledger. Like this video if the silence unsettled you. And in the comments below, tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Until next time, keep your records sealed, your floorboards quiet, and your names unchosen.